Hello everyone, and welcome to another instance of Micro Lessons by the Container Brothers. I'm Michael, Senior Director of Products here at Apprenda, and with me I have Eric Laskarder, one of our Senior Solutions Engineers here at Apprenda. Today we'll be talking about how easy Apprenda has made it to deploy Kubernetes-based applications on Apprenda. A few years back, we've made the decision to start supporting Kubernetes, a very popular cluster orchestrator in Apprenda. That means that in addition to be able to add Windows and Linux nodes to your Apprenda infrastructure, now you can add one or more Kubernetes clusters to Apprenda, and then you can use those to deploy Kubernetes-based applications. In this case, they will be Docker containers running either Windows or the Linux operating system. One big part of introducing this change is simplicity. We want to make it very easy for developers to develop in the language or programming framework that they love and use every day, and give them the same platform to deploy their applications. So this gives us a wide array of support for programming frameworks and languages. So anything the developers care for today or in the future, you can rest assured that Apprenda will support it. This gives us also standardization. If you are an IT organization that cares about delivering a self-service to your developers so they can in turn develop, deploy, and manage their applications, by standardizing on Apprenda, you get to provide your developers with the same user interface, the same API, and they don't have anything new to learn, whether they're deploying .NET applications, Java applications, .NET Core, Ruby on Rails, Python, or any other language they care about. They're going to have the same experience on Apprenda. So all they can do is concentrate 100% on innovation and on delivering their applications without having to worry about learning new tools or new processes on how to deploy and manage those apps. On top of that, since this API layer remains the same, an organization can build their CI and CD tools on top of this. So your continuous integration and your continuous deployment doesn't have to change because it pretty much remains the same. In fact, if you guys view the video we did on Jenkins a few weeks back, you can see a first view into how that all looks end-to-end when you deploy your entire CI/CD infrastructure using Jenkins. Now, on the Kubernetes front, by supporting Kubernetes, if you're a developer, you don't need to understand all the complexity around Kubernetes. If you are familiar with Kubernetes, you know that it's infinitely customizable. So both as an IT organization and as a developer, by letting Apprenda manage a big part of Kubernetes, you're simplifying that entire process. Now your IT organization can offer Kubernetes as a service to your developers, and all the developers have to do is bring their pod specification to Apprenda, and immediately their app is up and running into the Apprenda cloud. So let's go ahead and look at this in action a little bit, and Eric will walk us through an example on how to bring a Spring application into Apprenda via Kubernetes.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And before we go into the demonstration, I want to reemphasize that last point, because I think that's a lot of what organizations are struggling with. When we talk to these organizations that are starting their containerization journey, right? They're looking at tools like Kubernetes and Apprenda to deploy and manage their cloud native applications. The first question that we always get from development teams is, number one, how do I containerize my app? How do I put it into a Docker container so that I can deploy it? And then number two, how does Kubernetes make my life easier in that regards? And like Michael said, Kubernetes is extremely customizable, which gives you a lot of flexibility and power, but it also increases the complexity. So our job here at Apprenda is to provide, number one, IT organizations a way to offer Kubernetes-enabled platforms as a service while abstracting all of the complexity of setting it up. We allow the IT organization through our policy to dictate how Kubernetes gets consumed in the enterprise, to allow developers to easily deploy their applications, do log aggregation, monitoring around their applications, and then also provide developers a very easy way of containerizing and consuming these services in a standardized way. And I think that's a lot of the value, and you'll see how simple it is when we go through the demonstration here today. So let's go ahead and get started. Like Michael said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy the very simple starter Spring Boot REST service. So what I'm going to do, and I'm starting here, this is the Apprenda developer portal. We're going to come back to this in a moment. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the Restful web service source code. So I'll just copy the source code, and I'm just simply going to clone the repo here to my machine. And once I get this repository, this is the standard for anyone that's familiar with Spring Boot. This is the standard starter for their REST service. If I go into here, there's going to be a bunch of different folders, complete, initial, test. We're not going to go through the actual process of building the service. We'll just take the completed source code and containerize the output of this. So I'll go back into here. Let me just go into the complete directory. And they made it very easy to just build this project. This will output a jar file. Let me just go ahead and grab the actual command that I need. And it's just going to be Maven we're going to use Maven to build the application. So let's go ahead and do Maven clean package. And this is going to go ahead and build the actual application. It's going to download all of the dependencies. And then at the end of this process, we're going to have a jar file that has our application binaries, basically everything self-hosted within that jar file. Now, when you deploy this on Apprenda, and Michael, maybe you can expand a little bit on this as well. I can deploy just this jar file to Apprenda. I can provide that self-hosted application with its own container internally and deploy that via Apprenda. But we're going to be, in this case, putting that as well in a Docker container and then deploying it via Kubernetes. So we're adding a couple of steps just to show you how easy it is to containerize this application and deploy it via Kubernetes. But Apprenda does provide the flexibility to deploy this directly natively as it's built out. And Michael, what are some of the benefits, when you go through that way? What are some of the things that developers need to think about?
Yeah, absolutely. So what Eric mentioned here is super powerful. There's one of the big tenets of our platform is that we're trying to introduce as little stickiness as possible and none at all in most cases. So in this case, we have a jar file that Eric built using the Maven command, and he can take the jar file and put it in a Docker container, and he can deploy it natively into Docker supported by Apprenda. He can bring that Docker container into Kubernetes, which is what we're going to do today, and show you how easy it is to deploy that into a Kubernetes cluster managed by Apprenda. But he can also take that jar file and directly deploy it into a native Tomcat application server that Apprenda supports. In all of those cases, we're taking existing artifacts and existing contracts that people have been using for many years and taking the jar file and deploying into an application server that they're familiar with. But the fact that Apprenda is managing that application server, or the fact that Apprenda is managing the Kubernetes cluster, it gives you additional value-added benefits. So even though we're not modifying per se your application code and your innovation in your application remains the same, when you deploy it through Apprenda and in a managed way, through Apprenda, you're getting self-service as a developer. You're getting all of the policy compliance and security that an IT organization can set up for you. So in essence, an IT organization can ensure that if a developer is deploying their application through Apprenda, they're immediately in compliance based on the rules, regulation, and policies that they set up in place. So the developer doesn't get to see all of those things, but those are the guardrails that an IT organization has set up for them so they can operate in compliance with the regulations of their industry or their enterprise. So Apprenda itself doesn't introduce stickiness. You can take that same jar file and deploy it outside Apprenda on another distribution of Kubernetes if you like. But if you do bring it on Apprenda, you get all those benefits that I mentioned. In fact, one of the popular ways that people do this is that they use whatever development tools they need to develop their applications, whether those are .NET, .NET Core, or Java, and then eventually put that code into a repository. Think of Bitbucket, GitLab, GitHub, and eventually they have some form of source to image type of CI/CD process that takes that code, produces a Docker container on the fly, and then immediately pushes that Docker container into a Docker hub. And then from there, you can publish your Docker app on Kubernetes or Docker itself. Now, this kind of gives you a couple of benefits. It doesn't allow developers to produce their own Docker containers, and it gives you a little bit more control as an IT organization into the end-to-end process. So developers only care about the code, they're generating code, they're checking in code, that code goes into a public repository, and then you let your CI/CD process deal with everything else around, hey, am I gonna host this in a Docker container, or am I gonna take that jar file and push it directly into a Tomcat server and be done with it?
Yeah, and that's a very powerful value, that the fact that we provide developers with that choice. And you've seen through all the videos that Michael and I have recorded that Apprenda supports both this cloud native world where you're containerizing natively your application, or that existing frameworks or those existing architecture patterns. And there's value in deploying both by giving developers the choice of deploying their WAR file, their jar file, their binaries directly. Apprenda can be a lot more hands-on and essentially modernize and containerize on the fly the application as it gets deployed without the developer having to even learn how to do all of this on their own. Or the developer can take the choice and say, you know, I want to put this natively in Docker, or I want my CI/CD to do it. I'm going to figure out what the process is and build that into it so that I can do it once. And that's perfectly fine. You'll see how easy it is to deploy that as well on Apprenda. So once this build process, this packaging process is done, if I go to the target directory, here's that jar file that we're going to be deploying. Now at this point, I already created the Docker file that I need, and I'll show you what that actually does. It's a very simple process to get this Docker file. Let me go ahead and copy it over here. Let me just copy the Docker file. And if I open this up, just to show you what that Docker file has, very simple. It's just starting from the OpenJDK Docker image, creating a volume, passing the jar file, which you see here. This is the jar file that I'm going to be providing, and then just providing the command or the entry point to start my Docker container. And this is just starting the jar file. Very simple. It would be the same thing that I would be doing in my computer natively or on a server if I were to deploy this outside of Docker. So let's go ahead and put this here in the target directory. I'll place this here. We'll go back in here. Now I'm going to build my Docker container. So Docker build, we'll pass it a tag. And I've already created a repository in Docker Hub that's going to host this application. It's just called eLost Garden Spring Boot. So let's go ahead, let's go back here. And let's just tag this as version 0.1 and provide dot to tell the Docker daemon that this is where the Docker file exists. So we'll go ahead and build that. It's just simply, I had already the OpenJDK image, which is why it was so quick, packaged everything. And now if I simply do a Docker images, it'll show me all the different images that I have on my machine. Here's the one that we just created with the application binaries in it. So I can run this locally by just simply doing Docker run. But in this case, I'm going to push this to Docker Hub and then build a Kubernetes deployment file that will allow me to deploy this application via Apprenda onto Kubernetes. So we'll go ahead and just simply do Docker push and provide the name of this. Oh, I must have copied this twice. 0.1. And this is going to push that Docker image that I just built to Docker Hub. And this will take a few seconds while this application is just being uploaded to Docker Hub.
And if you guys are following from home, you can follow the same exact commands that Eric just followed, or you can even go to his public repository on the Docker Hub and download the same Spring Boot application, and you can deploy it on any Docker installation that you have natively.
Yep, and that's the value of packaging your application in Docker as well, is that anyone can download now this Docker image, and if you just run the Docker command or put it in Kubernetes, it should just work anywhere because all of the dependencies and the requirements are already embedded or packaged within this Docker container. So if I go back to my repository, I'll click on tags. We should be able now, just go ahead and refresh it. There's that 0.1 that I just pushed. So we have the image, we have everything in Docker Hub. Now what I need to do is construct that Kubernetes file. I'm gonna skip ahead through some of the concepts of Kubernetes, but I'll show you what the image has. So if I open up this deployment.yaml file, let me go ahead and open this here. What you're going to see is basically the information about the application. Now, in this case, it's very simple. I'm creating a replica set for my application on Kubernetes. And then I'm going to provide some additional information about the container or the application. I'll get into this in a moment, but Michael, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, this is a good thing to mention here, that if your developers, this is one of the first things that your developers need to know about Kubernetes. So if they're deploying an app on Kubernetes, they have to know how to construct the pod specification, which is, what Eric is showing you here. But if you don't want your team to understand even this complexity of Kubernetes, then those CI/CD tools and processes I mentioned earlier can auto-generate this for you, including the Docker container, and then your developers don't even know about this. All they have to know is, how do I develop my Spring Boot application or my .NET application, and let process and other tools generate this on the fly. So even though Apprenda is abstracting a lot of the Kubernetes complexities and the configuration and setting up and managing of Kubernetes, this is one of the things that if you want your developers to deploy and create the pod specs, they need to understand a little bit about Kubernetes to be able to define this. Now, a lot of these settings, like for example, the number of replicas are set to 3 there, you can also configure them from the Apprenda API or from the user interface. So once Eric deploys this into Apprenda, you'll be able to go to the scale tab and you see the number of replicas there. You're gonna see your components, in this case is your Spring Boot container, and you'll be able to modify your instance count for your application if you want to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What I'm going to do, just to start with a smaller replica count, I'll set it to 2, and all I need to do really after I have this template here that I've already used, I'm just going to change the image because that's not the image name of what we just created. We'll simply go ahead, and this is called Spring Boot. So we'll just go ahead and copy that here. And it's version 0.1, what we just created. So let's go ahead and copy that. And this is all I'm providing here as well from a pod specification. It's just a container port. Now Spring Boot by default exposes 8080. So I'm just telling Kubernetes to expose 8080 as well. And we're gonna get, once we deploy this application, into everything that Apprenda is doing behind the scenes to actually get this all wired and ready to go. So I've done what I need. Now I'm gonna go back to the Apprenda developer portal. If you've followed and seen the other videos, you know, developer portal is the graphical interface to deploy applications into Apprenda, and it's just a lot simpler to use that for this demonstration. So I'll use the GUI. So let's go ahead and create the application. Let's call this Eric Spring Kubernetes. And all I'm gonna provide as an application package is that Kubernetes deployment file. So if I just copy the location of this, it's C demo, here it is, that YAML file that we just created, save and continue. So this is creating the application on Apprenda, uploaded that YAML file. Now there's some additional configuration that I can do in the Apprenda world, but there's some that's that is important for this particular application. And you'll see how Apprenda allows you to expose also all of this capability, make it easy for developers to consume. So things like the architecture from a URL point of view, what do I want the URL of my application to be when it's wired into the load balancers, and just additional things that you can provide from an Apprenda point of view. A couple of the things that I want to show you, and you start seeing how Apprenda enhances the Kubernetes experience, either from an IT shared services point of view and also from a developer point of view. The first one I want to show is the scale and the policies engine. So you've seen this in every demo when you deploy applications on Apprenda, the ability for IT to set up what we call resource policies, which are ways of allowing the developer to enforce resource allocation for their individual instances. And this works both ways, right? It provides developers with an SLA and an assurance that they're going to get the resources that they need. It's also going to protect them from potentially a runaway application or some memory leak somewhere else in the system, and allow them to essentially have and ensure they have the amount of resources that they need to run their application. So this app is a little bit heavy, so I'm going to select this large pods policy. So every pod that gets deployed, it's going to be assigned half a core and 1500 megabytes of RAM. So I'll click on save for this. Now, if you were doing this directly on Kubernetes, you'll build this into your pod spec. But again, remember, Apprenda's value here is to allow IT to, it's two ways. It's to allow IT to offer a Kubernetes-based shared services platform. So abstracts a lot of this complexity and provides you a standardized way of consuming it. And for developers, I don't have to go learn all of those constructs. As you've seen in other demos, if I'm deploying .NET, Java, or whatever, this is all done exactly the same way. And the other thing that I'm going to do, which is as you get into distributed applications, this is extremely important, is the concept of just log aggregation, right? As a developer, as your application moves around and you don't really touch the infrastructure, how do you troubleshoot, or how do you know where your logs are? Apprenda natively is going to actually capture all of the logs coming out of the containers and aggregate it via the log aggregator. And we did another demo where Michael and I, where we integrated this with Splunk, so you can integrate and forward all of your logs to a third-party system like Splunk or your Elk Stack. But if you don't want to do that, Apprenda provides a log aggregation mechanism, and you're going to see all of the logs aggregated as soon as I create the log override for this application that will allow me to capture the logs that I need. So I'll just place it in info. This will capture the application logs and the container logs as it's being deployed.
And that's a super important feature, right? If you're having your application scaled to 5, 10, 20 instances and something goes wrong, you don't need to go hunting down and figure out where the problem happened, on what instance of your application, or how did it work, at what time, or if you need to correlate logs across multiple instances of your app. With Apprenda, make it simple. Bring all your enterprise logs into a single place. You can search and sort them here on Apprenda, or like Eric mentioned, forward them to Splunk and do some advanced analytics over your data and figure out what went wrong.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And you've seen other platforms simply let developers just pick and choose, which is fine. We want to give them options, and that's why we have the flexibility to do that as well. But providing this for a lot of the lower end environments, for example, we just want to make it simple for developers to consume these tools. So at this point, I've configured my application, and I'll hit promote. And this is the actual deployment process. This should be very familiar for anyone that has seen our other videos where we deploy different applications. But in this case, this is not going through the Apprenda native orchestration engine. In this case, we're actually contacting one of the Kubernetes clusters attached to this Apprenda environment and going ahead and deploying this set of pods and constructing all of the necessary Kubernetes objects to get this application up and running. If you were doing this yourself directly against the Kubernetes cluster, you would have to build first your replica set or a deployment, then you would build a service so that you get a static endpoint for your application. Then you'd probably build either an ingress rule so that you can map it through a URL or just map the port. There's a lot of things that you would need to do to get all of this. If you want to do that resource isolation, that's another configuration. A lot of things that need to happen. Log aggregation, you need to figure out. We just made things extremely easy for the developer to wire all of these things. So if I go now to monitor, you'll see that Apprenda matched that replica count from the spec file to the actual deployment. And we started with one, and there's another one that's being deployed as we speak. That's why we see one left. So Apprenda is going to tell Kubernetes to just match the two. And if I go to application logs, here are all the logs coming from my container. As the container starts, these are all the logs that are being outputted and being aggregated by the platform and stored by the platform as well. So I can, open one of these logs messages. It will give me the information about the logs. Operations will get all of access to the logs as well, so they can put policy around it and grooming policies. And there's a lot more that you can do with the logs. We're not going to get into that for the purpose of this. But at this point, the application is up and running. So if I simply go ahead and launch this application, we should go and hit our Spring Boot service running on Kubernetes. So if I go ahead and do that, I've had this issue where I think some of the cookies are choking the application. So there we go. There's the app, and that's actually an expected error from the application. If I go to the greeting endpoint, there we go. So we have our Spring Boot application. We Dockerized it. We built a Kubernetes YAML file and then deployed it to Apprenda, and also leveraging the log aggregation mechanism and the scaling mechanisms as well.
And in case you blinked, you probably missed it. Think about how simple it was. Eric built a Spring Boot app. He generated a jar file, which is something that developers know how to do very well. Then he created a Docker container out of it, which your IT organization can create for you, or you can do it yourself. And he uploaded a pod spec. And a couple of minutes later, he got a URL where he can get to see his application, manage it, run it through any test framework if he wants, or simply publish it into production. It was that simple. We went from a pod spec in Kubernetes. He didn't have to open up kubectl. He didn't have to open up the Kubernetes UI. He didn't have to do anything in Kubernetes beyond give us a pod spec. And a few minutes later, he has a URL endpoint to his application and he can manage it. That simplicity is super important to developers. And if your deployment tool of choice is Kubernetes today, or it might be something else, some next generation serverless application or something else down the road, we'll support it the same way, with the same simplicity, with the same constructs, same UI, same API. So your existing investments are going to be maintained, and we can allow developers to concentrate on innovation and operate in this type of self-service without caring about the complexity of the infrastructure and cluster managers and everything else. Now, another thing I want to point out here is this application that Eric created was a standard Java-based application. But if you wanted to create a kind of a mixed era application where you could have some microservices written in Go, or you wanted to have a database tier on the back end of your application, Apprenda supports it as well. Actually, in fact, our database as a service capabilities in Apprenda are second to none. We treat SQL Server and Oracle as both first-class citizens of the platform. So that means that your database, as well as your code in your application, are a single unit. They get versioned together, and you can create composite applications that span the data tier, the compute tier, and any other middle tiers that you want. That kind of simplifies everything from management, patching, versioning of your app, as well as operations, because everything is in a single unit. You no longer have to go find a network admin, a storage admin, a database admin, and maybe a compute admin before you can deploy your application. Your IT organization sets up all these guardrails, allows you to deploy your application in self-service, and all of these different steps become automatic workflow actions in Apprenda that you as a developer don't have to think about at all.
Yeah, and that's a very powerful concept. I think looking at our customers using the platform, for anyone that's been using Apprenda to deploy those traditional applications, and you get your developers, they're comfortable, they're very knowledgeable on the capabilities of Apprenda. Starting to leverage Kubernetes is something that can be enabled from one day to the next, right? If you think of where we started when we talked about standardization, all of our customers are already leveraging with Apprenda some CI/CD process. They're starting to move towards that agile SDLC, but they might not be using Kubernetes even though they want to, because that just requires learning a brand new platform and constructing all of this. So using any of those tools and simply providing, like Michael said, that source to image mechanism, developers already knowledgeable on Apprenda can immediately start deploying their applications to the Apprenda platform, or to Kubernetes, via the Apprenda platform, without having to go through another learning exercise, another learning cycle to start taking advantage. Now, of course, it is very beneficial to understand the capabilities of Kubernetes so that you can take advantage of everything it has to offer. But Apprenda makes it very, very simple and very easy to start consuming this from an IT organization, to start exposing and moving towards Kubernetes for your container orchestration needs, and providing all of that in a ready-to-use turnkey solution that enterprises can deploy and manage for both their IT and their developer organizations. So from a demo point of view, Michael, that's everything that I wanted to show. Hopefully everyone saw how easy it is to first package this application and then deploy it, and the functionality that Apprenda provides to just consume Kubernetes in a very, very easy manner. And those day two operations as well, like logging and scaling and monitoring, etc. So anything else that you want to add before we close it out for today?
No, that's it. I think the biggest takeaway, if nothing else, is that Apprenda is a Kubernetes-based product. Like Eric mentioned, we're extending Kubernetes clusters, so IT can offer both Kubernetes, like Windows and Linux, as a shared service to their developers or their business units. You can add one or more clusters to Apprenda, and then we enhance that entire end-to-end experience with enterprise support, policy, compliance, or security features, Windows, and existing app architecture support. And when you think about all of that, and the fact that we allow you to use any infrastructure of your choice, that's a big value-added value-added proposition for Apprenda. Thank you all for attending our Container Brothers video, and we hope to see you next time.